Hello, it's Dawn Michelle from Boho Tarot, and today we're going to do an anti-mod. Don't look at these are all modded. Today we're going to talk about some of the decks that I most likely will not mod and why. So before we kind of get into the anti-mod, let's talk a little bit about deck modification in general. Now I do have a whole video, it's a really old video, but I do have a whole video on my channel about my thoughts on deck modification as a part of or an extension to my tarot practice. So I'll leave that linked for you in the description box below in case you want to check that out. But if you are unfamiliar with deck mods, which is highly unlikely if you are on my channel because I do a lot of them, but basically deck modification is altering a deck in some way. So we're going to talk real quick about some of the different ways that I tend to mod my decks, and then we're going to do a little anti-mod, and I'm going to share with you some of the decks that I most likely will not mod and why that might be. Real quick, talking about modifications, the main kind of modifications that we have for a tarot deck is first of all edging. This is one of the most common types of deck modification where basically you're just taking a raw edged deck and you're coloring it in. This is my Everyday Witch Tarot, which I have modified the yellow marker and added some distressed ink to kind of give it that vintagey look to go along with what I feel reflects the deck's energy. So edging a deck doesn't really change anything about the artwork or anything about the deck itself. We're just basically coloring in the edges. So that's probably the most popular deck modification, is just to edge a white edged or raw edged deck. Another deck modification that's pretty popular is removing borders. So this is of course my little Llewellyn Tarot, and this did originally have great big borders, but I found that I really wanted to just take it down to the artwork. Now, the funny thing, and one of the reasons I wanted to make this video, is because a lot of times I get comments about how removing borders or cutting into a deck is defacing the deck in some way. So besides the fact that these are not the artist's original works of art, these are actually reproductions, I would not, of course, take the artist's original painting and chop it down, but to take a color copy of it essentially and chop it down, I think is totally fine. But it's important to remember that when we remove borders, we're not actually changing anything to do with the artist's interpretation of the deck or even modifying the artwork in any sort of way. I do have a couple decks that I have modified the original intention of the deck, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment. But in a case like this, where we're just removing the borders, I haven't taken off anything that is the artist's original artwork, right? I haven't taken away, I haven't cut off any of the cups, I haven't cut off the tree or the girl here sitting beneath it. All I've done is removed the titling and the border that the publisher added. An artist creates artwork for a deck. They don't create it with the borders and the titles and all of that on it. They create the work of art. What then happens from there is the publisher puts it on cards, adds the border, whatever else specifications they want to add. And so I think it's important to note that we're not actually changing the artwork in any way, shape, or form if we're simply removing the borders and titles. So that's another example of a really common deck modification, is to remove big borders. Now, sometimes people remove borders because they feel like it frees up the artwork. Sometimes people remove borders because it makes the deck smaller. Sometimes people remove borders because they just don't like the look of it. I have many examples of all of those on my channel. If you want to find out more, check out the Mod With Me playlist, and you'll see various examples of ways I've trimmed decks in order to remove borders for specific reasons. I don't, for the most part, willy-nilly hack at my decks. Usually when I am trimming a deck, I have a very specific reason for doing so. Now let's talk about when I do change the artist's intention. So this is the Archetypes Oracle by Kim Krantz, and this was originally a round deck. So I have reshaped this deck, I have trimmed it down, and I've made it kind of more rectangular. Now the reason I did this was because I'm not a fan of circle decks. They don't work well for me. I'm not coordinated enough to work with them. I do have a whole video on this particular deck if you're interested. I'll leave that linked in the description box below for you. But when this deck was round, I couldn't work with it. I had a hard time trying to get my hands around it, trying to shuffle it, trying to work it into my particular reading practice. And so it wasn't getting any use. This is a deck that I do quite enjoy. And so I wanted to work with it and I wanted to use it. So I had to get it into a shape that I could get my hands around, that I could work with, and that I could actually make use of in my practice. Now, this deck perhaps maybe was designed to be a circular deck. I don't know enough about the production of this particular deck to tell you if that was always the creator's intention or if that was something that came about through the production process. But either way, this is a case where I did actually change the shape of the deck, and therefore you could make the case that I changed the artist's interpretation of the deck. However, I personally don't believe that it changes anything to take a round deck, cut the sides off of it, and make it a rectangle. It still works. The energy's still there. I can still work with it in the same way as I would if it was round. This is just easier for me to handle and easier for me to work with, which basically means I'll actually work with it rather than just setting it on the shelf and letting it collect dust. So that's a pretty big modification in terms of changing the shape of a deck. So another deck modification that I might do, or that I often do, is to remove gilding. So this is the Influence of Angels Tarot, and you can see that I've actually retained the borders on this deck because I happen to like the borders on this deck. I think it makes it look like framed works of art. However, I did not care for the gilding that was on it, and so I took it off. Again, I have a video on this one as well on my channel if you want to see that. But I just took the gilding off. I just trimmed a slice of it off and then recolored the edges. And to me, it makes it easier to handle. It makes it softer to handle. I didn't like the gilding was cutting into my hands. It made the deck feel harsh, and I didn't really like that for this particular, the energy of this particular deck. So another thing that we might do with modifications is to reback a tarot deck. Now, that's often the case when you don't like a back. We'll use contact paper to cover it up and put something prettier that we like on it, or maybe we are trying to thicken up a thinner cardstock. That's often a reason that people will choose to add a layer of contact paper or something else to their deck because they feel the deck is too thin, it's not going to hold up, and so they add an extra layer of protection with the contact paper. So those are all the kind of main reasons why someone and why I will modify a tarot deck. But there are times, believe it or not, when I have no intention of modifying a tarot deck. So when it comes to edging, there are a few decks that I do not see myself ever modifying, and these are decks that are primarily white based. So this is the Hedwig Botanical. You can see there is all the white around the back, and then when we flip to the front, you can see that the artwork is all on white space. So this is a case where I probably wouldn't ever edge this deck because it has white on the front, white on the back. I feel like the white edges do work in this case, and I would be hesitant to edge this deck because I would be afraid that I would get color bleed on either the backs or the front, because that does sometimes happen when you edge a deck. So this is a case where I will probably leave this deck the way that it is. I'm going to say probably because I've learned to never 100% say I will not modify a deck, because it seems like as soon as I say that, something happens and I might end up modifying it. So another instance of a deck that I am almost 100%, let's say 99.9% sure that I'm not going to modify is the Oak, Ash, and Thorn. I do believe that this is the second edition. This is, of course, an indie deck. The Hedwig Botanical is a mass market deck. So again, that's something to consider, or something that I do consider when I'm looking at, am I going to modify a deck? This is a fairly expensive, independently produced deck. But the main reason I would never modify it, or I'm going to say I'm 99.9.99999 sure that I'm not going to modify this deck, is because it has these beautiful white borders, which I do like, and it has the beautiful white edges and the beautiful white backs. And I feel like to edge this deck would detract from the gorgeous white space that is in this deck. This deck also has kind of a unique cardstock to it, and I wouldn't want to run the risk of ruining the cardstock in any way. I also quite like these sort of raggedy painted edges that we've got on this white border and the little pops of the titles down at the bottom. I think that aesthetically this deck is done beautifully, is produced beautifully, and this is a case where the borders, the edging, nor the backs bother me in any way, shape, or form. It's also standard tarot size, so that works. And I have no desire to trim this deck whatsoever. I feel like that would actually take away from the sort of pristine energy that this deck has. It feels very clean, very simple, and yet very earthy. And I feel like if I were to edge it, that would detract from that for me. Now, again, this is all personal preference. So somebody may pick this deck up and go, that is way too much white for me, and I'm gonna edge the deck, and that's fantastic. It's not to say that if I choose not to edge a deck that somebody else couldn't. It's, of course, all our own personal choices and our own personal aesthetics. But these are two great examples of decks that I most likely will not edge because of the fact that they are very heavily based into the white space, and I feel like that is a part of the energy of the deck. So now let's talk borders, because that is another one of the big reasons why people like to modify decks. However, there are some cases where I actually like the borders the way that they are, or I have reasons for not wanting to trim off the borders. So let's talk first about decks that I like the borders the way they are. And here's an example. This is, of course, the Wild Unknown. I feel like for this, the borders are almost a bit iconic for this deck. We do have elements where the border does feel sometimes to be a part of the artwork. You can see here where we have the little triangles in the corner of this particular card. You can see it again here on this Three of Swords. And so this is a case where we have borders that are kind of sketchy. They're not just generated borders, right? This is an actual framework that is containing the artwork. And I feel like in this case, it does actually feel like a part of the artwork. It's not so much that the black frame creates the border, it's more like the card itself contained within this little black line is just a tiny bit smaller than the surface area of the card. And so we get that border effect. But you can see here, this is a perfect example. It's upside down, but there is a bit of ink. There's a little ink line, if you can see that, that is just extending outside of that line. And to me, that shows that this is a part of the artwork. So while I have seen this deck trimmed, and I've said many times, oh yeah, I'm gonna trim it, and I think it'll be fine, I've never actually gotten around to trimming it, and I think that's because I really just don't want to. I feel like the borders in this case are actually a part of the artwork, and so even though we do have the white space around the outside, it does feel like it's a part of the artwork, and it feels like it's a part of the deck for me. Now again, all just my own personal opinion, right? So here's an example of borders that I have kept because I feel like they serve a purpose. For this particular deck, and this is the Paulina Tarot, I feel like the borders actually do kind of help contain the artwork. Now I have looked at and talked to many people who have trimmed this deck and do love it, and it has been a deck that I have considered trimming many times. And I always say, oh yeah, I'm gonna get around to it, I'm gonna trim it. But this is another case where every time I get it out to look at it again to think maybe I might trim it, I think, nope, this is super busy artwork, and I'm afraid that if I take the borders off and they don't have that space to breathe between the cards, that it's gonna be overwhelming and it's gonna be too much, too busy on my table. And so this is a case where I feel like the borders actually do serve a purpose, and so I have left them. Let's talk real quick about mini decks. So this is the Barbara Walker Tarot, and there is a lot of border on this deck. And I do have to say that there is a part of me that's been tempted to cut at least the two sides off to take the copyright off, because I hate when publishers do that. Please don't put it on the front of the card. It doesn't stop people from stealing the decks or the artwork, as we know, right? Counterfeit decks are running rampant. Putting your copyright on the front of the card does no good. I can take this card into Photoshop, I could take that copyright off, and I could reprint it. It's not going to stop anybody who really wants to do it. Anyway, talking about trimming this deck, this is the Barbara Walker Tarot in a tin. So it's already, as you can see, a mini deck. It's quite small compared to, maybe we'll put it on here. Here's a Llewellyn deck. It's quite small in comparison. And I feel like if I were to take anything off of this, it's going to get so small that it might be actually unusable. While I like the tin versions and I think the size of them is great, they are fantastic for larger readings, especially something like a Celtic Cross. When I'm doing a Celtic Cross, my favorite types of decks to use are the mini decks or the pocket decks. So I love having these mini decks in my collection for that use, but this is a case where there's a lot of white space on the deck, and I think it would be really cool if I could take it down to just the artwork. But another thing to consider about this deck is we have not only the title down at the bottom, but we also have titles and keywords at the top, which I do actually use when working with this deck. So I definitely wouldn't want to chop off either one of those, because this, for one, is not a deck that I'm very familiar with, so I'm still getting to know it, and two, because I like having the keywords and the titles both. So my option could be to trim off the sides, but I feel like if I do that, I'm not really taking off anything that is going to make a huge significant difference with this deck. I would end up really making the back a mess. I really don't concern myself too much with the backs of a deck, but that is something that I do occasionally. I'll flip it over and take a look. You know, if I cut the sides off, then that's going to leave me just white on the top and bottom. I could try maybe just trimming off the whole white on here and hope that I don't end up cutting off any of the words. But again, this is a case where I feel like the modification wouldn't be worth the effort. It would make the deck really, really small. It would make the deck flop around in the tin. One of the great things about the tin decks is they are really, really portable. You can throw them in the tin and you can throw them in a bag, you can take them with you, and they hold up really, really well. Now, if I trim it down and it flops around in the tin, it's not going to be holding up quite as well because it's going to be knocking around in there every time I move the deck around. So this is an example of where I'm not a huge fan of all the border on the deck. I don't feel that the trim would be worth the effort because it does take a lot of time and effort to trim a deck. It's definitely something that I try to be mindful of before I just start hacking away at my deck. I look at the deck and go, is this worth the effort? And this is a perfect example because in this would be way more work than there would be benefit to. So those are the three main reasons why I might keep a border on a deck. One, because I feel like it's a part of the artwork, or I feel like it actually serves a purpose and contains the artwork, or as the case in the Barbara Walker, I feel like it wouldn't be worth the effort. So a couple of other things that might make me hesitate on taking a border off a deck would be an out of print deck. So this is my Animals Divine. This one, there's a couple of different reasons why I wouldn't take the borders off of it, to be perfectly honest. Again, like the Barbara Walker, we have titles at the top and bottom, and I do like them, and I do need them when I work with this deck. Would I love this deck to come out borderless with the titles and the names all at the bottom? Sure, that would be great. This is a case where the deck works well the way it is. I do actually like the borders. I do like that it has kind of the gold inlay border with the titles. There are little emblems around the titles. I think it's a very nicely designed deck with borders. Now I could edge it because even though we have white here, we have this kind of beige background on the back of the card. So I have thought about edging it in gold, and I will be perfectly honest, at some point I might, because I think that would look really pretty. But we're not talking about edging right now, we're talking about borders, and this is a case where the borders work for me. They serve a purpose and they're holding the text that I do need to work with these cards, and this is just a case where it works the way it is, but also it's out of print and it was fairly expensive. So I'm going to be much more cautious with what I do to it because it's a harder to get a hold of deck. And I don't really say that for monetary reasons. I'm not opposed to modifying an expensive deck. I have done it before and I'm sure I will do it again. If I choose to spend money on a deck and I choose to make changes to it, I own it, I can do that. But more what I'm looking at is not so much of, oh, it's an expensive deck, it's an out of print deck in terms of the price. What I'm looking at is if I totally screw this up, I can't easily replace this because it's out of print. So that's where my hesitation comes in with this particular deck, is that it's hard to get a hold of. So I'm gonna be real cautious with what I do to it, because if something goes poorly, which it has on occasion, I can't easily replace it. It's one thing if I mess up a $20 tarot deck from US Games, I can replace it. It's not that big of a deal. To get my hands on and find another out of print deck to replace is a totally different story. So that's the reason I might be more cautious with an out of print deck. However, I have modified out of print decks. If you want to see one, check out the Mythic Tarot mod that I did. So the last little thing that I might consider when looking at borders is the age of the deck. So this is the Angel Blessing cards, and I do believe this deck is either coming back or is back in print. I will take a look and let you know in the description box below. I have left the borders on it because it's beautifully vintage. It smells like old paper, and I want to keep the deck kind of in its original form. So even though it has these big gigantic borders, again, this is also a case where I would need, of course, the keywords, but also the angel name at the top. I could, however, trim down the sides, but as you can see, they're not all the same size either. So I would have to make adjustments to that if I was going to trim this deck and take the sides off, because as you can see, this artwork is skinnier than this artwork. But this is more of a case of I want to keep it the way that it is. It was well worn and well used and well loved by someone else, and then it came to me, and I just want to honor that. So that's a look at some of the decks that I might actually want to keep the borders on. And finally, let's wrap things up with talking about gilding. Now, if you've watched my channel for any amount of time, you've probably heard me belly ache about gilding. I am not a fan. In general, not a fan of gilded decks. I prefer they just come plain edged and I can edge them myself in whatever color I choose. But there are some cases where I not only will leave the gilding, but maybe even like the gilding. It's rare, but it does happen. So a couple of instances of that might be, here we have the Empathetic Oracle, and this is by Schiffer, I do believe. And this is a case where I've just left the gilding on because it doesn't bother me. It's not particularly great quality gilding. I think because it's an oracle deck, it's smaller. It doesn't really bite into my hands too much. I'm still able to work with it. It's holding up fairly well considering the amount of use that I've given this deck. Now, I have had other decks by Schiffer where the gilding didn't feel like this and I cut it off because I didn't like it. But this is a case in this particular deck. You can see how beat up it is because I riffle shuffle. I'm not sure that the gold actually like aesthetically really matches the energy of the deck, but this is a case where the gilding really hasn't bothered me any, so I've just left it because it's, again, similar to the Barbara Walker Tarot. Would it be worth the effort? It doesn't bother me enough to interfere with my work with this deck, and so it's not really worth the effort to go through the whole process of trimming the deck down and removing that gilding just for the aesthetics of it. Not that I haven't done that before, but this is a case where the gilding is fine. It doesn't bother me. It's not my favorite, but it works, and I'm leaving it because it works as is. So there are some cases where I actually like the gilding. It's rare, but it does happen. This is the Forager's Daughter Tarot. I think there's a newer edition out or coming out soon, and it has this beautiful rose gold gilding, which I think aesthetically fits the look of the deck beautifully. It just has this very soft, wonderful color tone to it that just gives a nice little soft bit of a shine to it, and it it fits the energy of the deck really well. It's also very high quality gilding. It's holding up very well, and it doesn't, you know, bite into my hands when I shuffle or anything. I still riffle shuffle it even though it's gilding, and I actually quite like the look of it. It's interesting, it's different. I like when people do something different than just gold or silver. So then we have the newer instances, or the probably less frequent instances of matte gilding. So of course this is the Moonchild Tarot, which is upside down. Not that it really matters because we are talking about the sides of the deck. This is beautiful matte gold gilding. It's not shiny. It doesn't have a feel to it, whereas like I can feel the metallic-y overlay on the sides of these cards. This one has no feel to it. It feels just the same as if I were to take a gold stamp and run it along the edges. It's beautiful, it holds up really well, and it doesn't impede my work with the deck. And this is my favorite type of gilding if they're gonna gild a deck. I prefer it to be matte, although my preference is still no color at all so that I can do it myself. Then lastly, we have decks that have not only the gilding done really, really well, but again, we're looking at an out of print, harder to get deck. So this is the Tildwick Tarot. This is the first edition of it, and it came gold gilded, and this is really high quality gilding. I have used the heck out of this deck. I have riffle shuffled it repeatedly. I've had this deck for a couple years now, and it's holding up beautifully. So it's really high quality gilding. It's beautifully produced, but again, it's a case of it's a deck that was quite spendy, but more importantly, would be difficult for me to replace should a trim go wrong. But this is more of an example of gilding that is just done really, really well. The gold, metallic gold gilding works beautifully with the aesthetic and the energy and the voice of this deck, which is very much in this like Victorian manner. So I think it fits the energy of the deck, it fits the aesthetics of the deck, and it's also really, really high quality gilding, so it works beautifully. So there you go. That is just a look at some of my anti-mods, some of the decks that I most likely will not be modding. I never say never because you just never know. I might decide at some point the Moonchild is just too dang big for me to work with, and I might trim it off. You know, I might decide that I don't want the borders on the Wild Unknown anymore, so I might chop those off. Or I might decide that, you know, I do want to go ahead and edge my Animals Divine. Out of all of the decks that I've shown here today, this one is the most likely to get a mod eventually, but at this point it's still not on my deck mod list. But I thought it would be fun to just kind of take a moment and talk about the decks that I don't really have an intention of modding and why. And as always, my friends, thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon for more creative tarot for an inspired life.